We are in a new era of political violence and chaos in the United States, and it's only gonna get worse. On September 10th, 2025, Charlie Kirk was assassinated. All the evidence suggests the person who carried out this evil act was on the left side of the aisle. It was a political act. Just as I'm finishing up this script, a sniper shot 3 detainees at an ICE facility in Dallas, another political attack. These events follow 10 years of escalating political and ideological violence in this country. On June 17, 2015, a shooter killed 9 black Americans in a Charleston church. On July 7, 2016, a shooter killed cops in Dallas. On June 14, 2017, a leftist opened fire on Republican congressmen practicing for a baseball game, injuring 6. On August 12, 2017, there was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. On September 24, 2017, a gunman targeted whites in Antioch, Tennessee, killing 1. On October 27, 2018, a shooter attacked a synagogue in Pittsburgh, killing 11. On August 3rd, 2019, a mass shooter killed 23 in an anti-Hispanic attack in El Paso. On May 26, 2020, George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis, sparking nationwide protests that escalated into riots. In several instances, clashes caused deaths, for example in the case of Kyle Rittenhouse. Protesters also occupied Capitol Hill in Seattle for a month. On October 8, 2020, the FBI arrested 13 men in a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. On January 6, 2021, rioters broke into the Capitol building as part of an organized and disorganized attempt to reverse the results of the election. On May 14, 2022, a shooter killed 10 black Americans in Buffalo. On October 28, 2022, a man assaulted Paul Pelosi with a hammer. On July 13, 2024, a shooter narrowly failed to assassinate Donald Trump in Butler, PA. On September 15, 2024, a second assassination attempt on Trump failed. On December 4, 2024, Luigi Mangione assassinated a healthcare CEO. Plenty of people supported that. On January 20, 2025, soon after being sworn in, Trump pardoned over 1,500 January 6ers, releasing former leaders of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. On June 14, 2025, a Minnesota state representative was assassinated and another was shot. On September 10, 2025, Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Orem, Utah. This list does not include dozens upon dozens of smaller attacks and planned attacks stopped by the FBI and law enforcement, but the data is unmistakable. The United States is in a new era, America's own years of lead. This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video's about. Like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow. This video might be demonetized, so I appreciate the support. So, what's going on? We've had a couple periods of political violence in this country before. Obviously before, during, and after the Civil War, that was one major example. We had another wave of violence in the early 1900s thanks to anarchists, and around 1968 we had another wave, especially from radical left-wing movements. There's not really a good name for these periods, but one term is growing more and more common: years of lead. Let's rewind back to 1968 when riots and protests erupted across the world. In America, alongside major protests, Robert F. Kennedy and MLK were assassinated. Let's focus on Italy though, where students rioted in universities. In March, police battled students in Rome. The next year, workers launched strikes across the country, while a series of bombings began to kill people, most prominently 17 at Piazza Fontana. The government blamed anarchists for the attack. Police even flung one of them out of a window, but later investigations point blame toward Italy's growing neo-fascist movement instead, which had the secret support of the government and probably the CIA. Their goal was to cause enough chaos and violence to justify an authoritarian government. Over the next 20 years, violence continued, with the far left organizing the Red Brigades and carrying out assassinations, and even abducting and murdering former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, while the far right killed dozens in more bombings, including 85 people in Bologna, and even organized conspiracies to topple the government, which all fizzled out. Violence began to slow down in the 1980s and came nearly to an end with end of the Cold War. There's still some carryover to this day. These were the Italian years of lead. They're an excellent parallel to what is currently happening in America: growing political violence. Why is this happening? Well, I think there is a pretty simple and obvious explanation for this. Democracy, fundamentally, is a way to relieve pressure that builds up among the population. That pressure can come from all sorts of sources, but in this case there is clearly increasing economic stress beneath the surface due to the failure of the recovery after the Great Recession and COVID shutdowns. People attribute this economic stress to immigrants, like on the populist right, or the millionaire and billionaire class on the populist left. If you're familiar with this channel, you probably know what I think. When our representative government fails to relieve this pressure, people take out their frustrations with violence. We saw this on January 6 with the George Floyd riots, and we're seeing it now during the second Trump presidency from the left. As long as people are motivated by political causes whose agendas cannot or are not fulfilled by the political system, there will continue to be violence. This is not to comment on the merits of those agendas, but simply why people turn to violence. Now, of course, some people who engage in the violent acts that I've talked about so far have profound mental illness or just want attention. Thomas Matthew Crooks, for example, the guy who narrowly missed Trump, searched for dates and places for appearances for both Biden and Trump. That's according to the FBI. Luigi Mangione isn't exactly an ideologically committed leftist, for example, judging from his manifesto, even if some on the left have embraced him. So it's not just political, but it's all in the political atmosphere that's growing worse and more radical. So what next? Well, I do think, unfortunately, this is all going to keep getting worse. President Donald Trump is completely uninterested in lowering the national temperature, and I don't think the policies of the Trump administration, or even a typical Democratic administration like Joe Biden, can address the fundamental root causes of this growing violence. Unfortunately, that means the FBI and law enforcement will likely continue to be very busy over the next years. Inevitably, attacks will slip through. Judging from previous attacks, people on the radical right will continue mass shootings. People on both the radical left and the radical right will continue to target politicians. I think ICE is probably going to be a big target, judging from current trends. There will likely be large riots again in the future, probably surrounding the 2028 presidential election or the one after that. As radical groups grow more and more sophisticated with time, you might expect more sophisticated attacks. Right now, there is just not any large and organized group on the left to match the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers when it comes to actual political action. Antifa is decentralized. You might expect radicals on the left to organize a new weather underground, America's own Red Brigades, which can carry out the sort of planned attacks we've seen the FBI foil, like the attempted abduction of Gretchen Whitmer. But will this escalate into civil war? Probably not. But there is a chance. Unlike the 1920s, for example, we do have state governors today on opposite sides of this political divide. We got Republicans and we have Democrats. If the 2028 presidential election results are disputed, if the candidates are controversial or hated enough, then it's not impossible to imagine state governors refusing to recognize the results. What happens then? Well, states don't actually have power over whether Congress confirms somebody president. The federal government does not source its legitimacy from the states, but we the people. That's why they wrote that in the Constitution. Besides being a symbolic gesture, for a state governor to functionally refuse to recognize the president as legitimate, that would necessarily entail ceasing cooperation with federal officials and maybe even attempting to prevent federal officers from carrying out their duties in that state. It wouldn't be hard to imagine a Democratic state governor trying to crack down on ICE agents or any state governor trying to crack down on the FBI. But courts will probably side with the federal government based on how our legal system works. The Supreme Court, for example, will probably throw out the recent California law that bars ICE agents from wearing masks. If a bold governor ignores these courts, he might cause a standoff between state police and federal agents. The National Guard will not be a major player in any such situation because the president has the ability to federalize National Guard units. But more and more states have their own state defense forces. So far, these are pretty small. As far as I can tell, the states that have them, like Florida and Texas, have fewer than 2,000 each. In the future, they might grow larger, though. What's the difference between a state guard and a national guard? Well, state guards, as outlined by U.S. law, may not be called, ordered, or drafted into the armed forces. That means the president doesn't currently have the power to federalize state guards. So state guards might just play a role in any hypothetical standoff between state and federal officers. They're not currently a major force in America, as state militias were during the last Civil War, but they might become a major force in the future. Even then, I don't think a civil war is likely. I simply do not believe there is much of an appetite for it among the political class, which is the class of people who actually would make the decision to go to war. Plus, power in America is very concentrated at the federal level, at least compared to the last Civil War. So if any state makes a significant attempt at independence, the federal government could crack down very efficiently and effectively. That's the case currently, but it might change in the future. On the other hand, there is a ground-up swelling of violence among the people, enough to say that we are in the American years of lead. Let me know if you'd like to talk more about how a second civil war would play out if it did play out. And if you'd like to support the channel and get early access to future videos, you can do so on patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Thanks to those who already do, and adios.